this lecture, we're looking at the exercises from Chapter 16, Incorporating Sources into Your Own Argument. You are given an original passage from the American Council on Science and Health, titled, Is Vegetarianism Healthier Than Non-Vegetarianism?, followed by three writers, writer 1, 2, and 3, who each use this passage as a source for their own argument. Our first question asks us to look at the different ways that each writer incorporates the source material in his or her argument. Writer 1 does so in a very minor way. Writer 1 takes only one small piece of information from the original source, that vegetarians have a lower risk of becoming alcoholic. Writer 1 does this because Writer 1's concern is not vegetarianism on its own, but alcoholism. Writer 1 only cares about the facts about vegetarianism that are related to alcoholism. So Writer 1 takes one small statement from a fairly several paragraph passage to add to his or her argument. Writer 2 has a different purpose. Writer 2 is advocating vegetarianism. Writer 2 wants to convince people that vegetarianism is a good idea. So when Writer 2 looks at the original argument, Writer 2 takes out all the facts that support his or her argument. That vegetarianisms have longer life expectancy, suffer from fewer chronic diseases, that vegetarianism can be linked to a reduced risk of cancer and other ailments. So Writer 2 takes out all of those positive aspects and uses those in the summary of the original source. Writer 3 has a much different point of view than Writer 2. Writer 3 wants to actually show us that vegetarianism does not necessarily have the same results that some people claim it does, people like Writer 2. So Writer 3 looks at the original passage and takes all of the qualifiers, the places where the original passage says, this may not be true, or this may be linked for a different reason, and Writer 3 focuses on those aspects of the original and uses those in his or her argument. So we have three different selections of material from the same passage that are used, depending on each writer's individual desire to make a specific point. Our second question asks us, if you were the author of the article from the American Council on Science and Health, would you think that your article is used fairly and responsibly in each instance? Students' answers on this front may differ a bit. Now, the first thing you should ask yourself is whether any of these authors have plagiarized the original source. And the answer is no. They have all cited the original source and given the original source credit for its ideas. So they haven't been unfair in that respect. Next, you want to ask yourself whether they present the original source as having said something that it did not actually say. And if we look back at all of these sources, we can see that every bit of evidence that each of these sources attributes to the original is part of the original. For example, we see a lower risk of becoming an alcoholic here in quotation marks, and if we scroll up to the original source, we see the phrase, a lower risk of becoming alcoholic. All of these authors have fairly represented the original source. Now, some students feel that maybe these writers have been less than fair. And I think the reason that some students believe that is because of a bit of a confusion between purpose and fairness. Now, the original writer's purpose is to portray all of the possible benefits of vegetarianism, as well as the reasons why those benefits may be overstated. The original author wants to provide a balanced and thorough overview of the health repercussions of vegetarianism. Now, none of these other sources have the same goal. Writer 1's goal is to talk about alcoholism and only talk about vegetarianism as it relates to alcoholism. Writer 2 wants to promote vegetarianism and writer 3 wants to question vegetarianism. So their goals do differ from the original source, and if you expect them to be following the same goal as the original source, you may fault them, saying, for example, that writer 3 is unfair because they give all of the qualifications without listing all of the benefits. Or, conversely, that writer 2 is unfair because writer 2 uses only the benefits from the original source. But what it's important to remember is that all authors, including you when you write your papers, will be doing this. You'll take the information from the original source that suits your argument. You will focus on the parts of the original source that support your argument. Your job is not, most of the time, to provide a thorough summary of the original source. It's to support your own argument and use only the material from the original source that supports your argument. If we look at question 3, if your goal is to summarize the argument, your summary should be different from the partial summaries because you should include all of the main points from the original. If you only want to reproduce the original argument, then you use all the points. But if your goal is different, then it is fair to use the original to support a goal that is different from the original, as long as you are citing the original source and giving it credit for its ideas. If we look on pages 381 and 382, we have a fourth example of a writer who has used the same source. This writer, we are told, has plagiarized the original source. And the questions that follow ask us to look at how the writer has done that. So what's wrong with this passage? Well, first of all, there are no quotation marks anywhere in this passage, but there are phrases that have been taken directly from the original source. You cannot use the same words that a source uses in the same order without indicating that you have done so with quotation marks. To do otherwise is to plagiarize. We also note that we don't give the author credit. We do give the author credit here at the beginning. We do say according to the American Council on Science and Health, but we only say that once. When you are citing from a source, you need to make sure that every time you take information from that source, you indicate the source of your information. That means every sentence. We could do that with parenthetical citations in each sentence, or we could use attributive tags. So we could say, according to the American Council on Science and Health, the health of vegetarians may be better than that of non-vegetarians, partly because of non-dietary factors. And then in the next sentence say, the ACSH also reports that people who eat only vegetables tend to be very conscious of their health. Of course, we would need to correct the paraphrasing issues as well, in addition to adding these attributive tags. How would you explain this problem to the writer? Well, first of all, explain that in most papers, we expect there to be a mix of ideas from the author and the original source. That's why it's especially important to make clear in every sentence where the idea came from. You want credit for your own ideas, so you want the reader to understand that if you don't say it's from a source, it is from you. You also may be using more than one source, and that makes it important to distinguish where each of your ideas has come from. Some of the ideas will be yours, some will be from one source, some will be from another source, etc. You also would tell the student who accidentally plagiarized this passage, if in this case it was an accident, that they didn't use quotation marks to give the author credit for his or her phrasing. Remember, we always want to give authors credit for two things. First, if the idea comes from someone else, we want to give that person credit for having the idea, which we do with attributive tags or parenthetical citations. Second, if the actual wording is also from the source, we want to give our source credit for designing that exact wording with quotation marks. Our third question asks us, what caused writer 4 to misuse this source? What do you think that the writer could do differently, or did differently from other writers who didn't make the same mistake? Well, this writer could have done several different things. Perhaps, when the writer 4 was copying from the original source, he or she copied some of the passage word for word and paraphrased some in his or her mind. Then, when writer 4 looked at his or her notes, he or she wasn't sure which words came from the original and which ones didn't. It's also possible that writer 4 may have remembered some of the original wording and failed to check to make sure that he or she wasn't reproducing that original wording. Another thing that could happen, especially with internet technology, is that writer 4 could have copied the entire passage and pasted it into his or her document. Then, went back and changed a few words. However, obviously, writer 4 did not change enough words to be considered a paraphrase. This is what your book calls patch writing, and I call insufficient paraphrase. Writer 4 has made some effort to change some of the words, but has not significantly changed enough of them to be considered a paraphrase. Maybe writer 4 was in a hurry. Perhaps writer 4 was working on an assignment he or she had left to the last minute. Or perhaps writer 4 didn't understand how to cite sources. Maybe he or she was absent on the day this was covered in class, or didn't read the assignment that instructed the class on how to do this correctly. Maybe he or she thought that giving the source at the beginning of the passage was enough. However, for whatever reason, writer 4 failed to cite this passage correctly and did end up committing plagiarism. Hopefully, after looking at these sources, you'll have a better idea not only how to use sources to support your specific purpose, but also what you shouldn't do if you want to avoid plagiarism.